Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by TheLastCurryRice. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about small game versus big game mentality, and as a way to kind of talk about encounter design. In Library of Runa and Rimbus Company, that's a good start, Limbus Company. Last Curry Race begins. Each of these topics is something I've wanted to talk about for a while, small game and big game, and then Library of Runa and Limbus Company. But I couldn't think of enough to talk about for each. Today I realized I could combine them into one parlay. A strategic theory in Magic the Gathering ties surprisingly into a conceptual difference between Project Moon's two titles, Library of Runa and Limbus Company, and why the two games have very similar gameplay mechanics but play out so differently in practice. Let's get some terminology straightened out. A spectrum of strategy coined by former Magic the Gathering pro player Sam Black, small game to big game. So it's meant to be a spectrum. We're just going to explain what the points are, but note that obviously most games are not literally just one or the other. Small game. You want the whole game to revolve around less game pieces. Individual pieces' strength matters more, and you're looking to trade resources until you're the one with the last remaining piece. Even if your sole game piece is some dinky little guy, your opponent can't stop it, so you eventually win. When you win, it's because the opponent had no cards in hand and or no creatures on board. You're trying to break up your opponent's synergies so your individually strong cards will matter more. Cards like Thoughtseize and Lightning Bolt fit this space. Red deck wins, black mid-range decks, and blue tempo decks are examples of this. So that's one end of the spectrum versus big game. The strategic opposite of a small game, you thrive when every player has a bunch of game pieces, but your pieces scale up with each other in a way where your overall number overpowers the opponent's. Even if the opponent gets to do their thing, they don't matter to you because what you're doing is way more impactful. You eventually win. When you win, you're fine with the opponent doing what they want to do. What you want to do is just more impactful. You're trying to push your synergies to the max to make more of your opponent's individual cards matter less. Sleep and Overrun would be cards that fit this space. White-blue control, tribal decks, and big-green ramp decks would be decks that fit this space. And how that relates to Limbus Company and Library of Runa. I've heard too many discussions comparing Library of Runa and Limbus Company, saying the latter, Limbus Company, is too dumbed down and easy. I wanted to really pinpoint where that feeling was coming from, especially because I feel the depth of gameplay is equal, and the difficulty difference is a given when comparing the late game encounters with the early game of its sequel. Right, Library of Runa is complete, and Limbus Company is a live service game that is ongoing, and so we are like at the beginning or middle of Limbus Company. You could say, of course, the fights you remember from Runa are harder. Okay, we'll come back to that a little bit, though. Taking the strategic concepts I brought up earlier, I've realized Library of Runa pushes for a small game, and Limbus Company tends to prefer a big game. Both games have a lot of similarities: clashing, the winner hits, the loser doesn't, actions with visualized variants, dice rolls versus coin flips, redirection based on speed, player response to enemy actions, a deck of skills that refresh once expended, a secondary stat other than HP that causes immobilization, stagger resist versus sanity, the second deck of powerful skills, ego in both games, build around separate from the units, abnormality pages and ego gifts, and multiple units on both teams. And the differences start from team building. Library of Runa has way more customization per unit. You can both change the skill compositions of an ID with their key page and the passives they have. You can make a single unit the strongest thing known to the Project Moon universe at the cost of not being able to make any more copies of that build. Runa's equivalent to ego gifts tend to only affect one chosen unit on your team, so usually there's not much of a reason to build around more than one unit per team. Because there's only one or two units to fully invest resources into, the remaining members end up being fine to trade off during an encounter, pushing for a more small game play loop. In Limbus Company, though, there's a definite ceiling for each individual unit, and a lot of its team building is to maximize the total efficiency of the team, covering insufficient areas for an ID like sin color generation, or meeting certain conditionals the ID can't make up on their own. The game has a couple mechanics, like resonance, to make up for small differences in clash power or ego that are fueled by the team's sin usage, that reward the player the more the whole team is built well, fitting with the big game idea. Okay, lots of stuff, so pause here. Yeah, so the idea here is that small game versus big game mentality, we threw a lot of stuff at you, but I liked how TheLastCurryRice structured the beginning. The idea is that the small game and big game idea from Magic the Gathering theory might be where people are familiar with it. Fits pretty nicely into critiquing Library of Ruina and Limbus Company. These are games that use very similar mechanics on the surface, but the structure around them, the build system around them, perhaps, the way they fit into the build system, these things are very different. And so the result is a game where in Limbus Company, you could say the main difference is the game is kind of forcing synergy to be important. There are a lot of things in Limbus Company's design that require you to combine things together. And thus, there isn't the same feeling of one unit is going up against, the boss or whatever because you power them up a bunch. And instead, you're getting, a whole squad that is meant to work together as a cohesive whole and cover each other's weaknesses, fighting against, probably sufficiently scaled up enemy stuff. And so you could say that you have more options in Limbus Company. I haven't played Library of Ruina, so I'm going to have to make some guesses about the two games. Please don't take it to heart if you like Library of Ruina. I don't know or care, whether it makes sense to enjoy that game. I don't know. I bear no animosity whatsoever toward, I just also know nothing about, really, Library of Ruina. I played a tiny bit of the beginning of the game. We are going to come back to that a little bit later, though. The idea of I thought it was interesting what you said, TheLastCurryRice, about the beginning and the end of each game being compared. Like, people are probably thinking of end game Library of Ruina fights, but we're really more in the beginning of the middle of Limbus Company. I feel like there's something there, but I do feel like there's sort of a problem between the two games that we'll get into a little bit later. Anyway, we want to get more into choices. How is the game shunting you more into being about, big game or small game? And how can we compare that to what people seem to think about difficulty? They seem to think Limbus Company is way simpler. Well, why? I mean, on the surface, the mechanics are more analogous, and Limbus Company is asking you to additionally make a team that works well together. What's going on? In Limbus Company, your hand of cards will always have at least 3 different skills to choose from, one of them always being a defensive action. In Ruina, you actually have to draw the skills you use, and by having more than one skill slot, you will run out of skills to use without ways to draw more than one a turn. There also exists a mana system, where skills cost a resource that also needs specific skills to recover. Due to these mechanics in Ruina, anytime you attack, clash, anything, you're trading a resource, skill in hand or mana, that needs time or other actions to recover. Many enemies follow the same rules as the player and can run out of skills or mana if the fight goes long, and the small game mindset of constantly trading resources applies. It's almost a requirement to run card draw and mana generation in a deck in Ruina, and due to this, there's far fewer slots in a deck to run fun pages if you don't want to get mana screwed and enter top deck mode. In Limbus Company, since there's no separate resource for stuff like mana or a depleting hand, you're more free to build for other elements of the game, like statuses and team synergies. In Magic lingo, it's like if there was a Howling Mine type effect on board, so you'd want to run effects that work best when both players have a full grip, a big game focused experience. I want to finish up this next section before I come back to that. The last difference is how variance of an attack or defense is treated between the two games. In Limbus, the randomness is complete 50-50. Coin flips at the start, but slowly becomes more skewed toward getting a desirable flip as you progress in an encounter because you gain sanity, which directly modifies your chance to win coin flips. Because of this, encounters tend to throw in moves that normal skills can't deal with, even at max sanity, so that you're incentivized to build so you can fuel egos, which often have higher clashing power, but then lose you a chunk of sanity. In Library of Ruina, the dice rolls result in almost always fully random things, from X to Y value. If you're in a clash against an enemy rolling roughly equal ranges, no matter how far into an encounter both sides have equal odds of winning, of losing, or tying. So there is a constant exchange in health as a resource, since you can never fully guarantee a clash win without making your minimum roll higher than the enemy's maximum. Again, in other words, because you can't kind of increase or guarantee your probability, Even if the game offers options to build in a way where you could clash high enough, Library of Ruina is simply structured in a way where you always won't some of the time. So you always get that, people are taking damage and exchanging resources. Whereas in Limbus Company, you're being more encouraged to build in a way where you negate almost everything the opponent does. And that's possible if there are things that clash high enough, because you can build for the sanity, consistency, and ego resource generation needed to counter all those things. A skill's clash win per die rather than per skill also adds to how often you could lose health during even a favorable clash. In Limbus Company, you have full wins or losses. You either beat out the enemy attack completely or get hit. But in Ruina, a clash could result in both parties taking some damage, since each row of dice clash separately, and the winner of each bout gets to hit the loser. One game constantly trades health as a resource, even into the late game, which results in the winner being the Survivor, a small game in Library of Ruina, while the other rewards the player with complete domination once you get your sanity and sin resources set up. Big game mentality. I want to pause here. I think this is where, for me, first of all, TheLastCurryRice, I think your explanation is extremely helpful. This really helped break it down for me mentally. I have a much more developed opinion about I do not think Limbus Company is a particularly easy game in the abstract. It's not always super difficult from my perspective, but my perspective doesn't matter. I have all this stuff in the game, all the time in the world to discuss it, exposure to essentially as many good tactics as I can possibly find, and I've played many, many games with somewhat similar mechanics over the years. So of course I don't find it like super hard all the time. But even then, I kind of feel like it's disingenuous that people look at that experience and say it's easy. If anything, the description makes it sound harder than what Library of Ruina is doing, right up until the idea that once you get your sanity and sin resources set up, you kind of dominate the encounter. I feel like this just, maybe people are having different experiences than me, but I feel like it's just not true that the game sort of smooths out after that. Most encounters in Limbus Company are designed so that you set up your sanity and sin resources, and then you're put in a situation where you have to gamble them away, do an ego or whatever, to clash an attack that has too high of a clashing value. You lose some sanity, you lose your ego resources, you got to keep maintaining those resources and get your sanity back, or if you don't for long enough, you're going to kind of fall off the balance beam, is how I often think of it, and your sanity will go too low, you'll corrode and maybe kill your teammates, you won't have the ego resources, so you won't be able to clash, and you'll get hit. Stuff like that. More of a balancing act. Whereas, to me, the idea that there's really no way to permanently avoid taking any incoming damage, there's a somewhat random way in which damage always comes through in Ruina, that to me sounds like the type of experience people often say is more difficult, but which when it boils down to it, it sounds more random, essentially. This is where I would like to spend some time, not the whole parlay, but some time talking about the way people refer to difficulty between the two games, to kind of add to this setup that Library of Ruina and Limbus Company are pursuing different types of experiences, small game versus big game. I want to add the idea that players think of difficulty in a kind of twisted way that doesn't really mean that something is challenging. And I think that when you add that to this equation, it's a little bit clear what's going on. After all, I would argue that in Magic, for example, a small game in Magic where you've got your one guy and you reject everything your opponent does and you push through, it's not that that is less difficult. But it does mean that you can, again, kind of just keep on pushing forward. And as long as you maintain your small game tempo, well, your opponent can't do the big thing they were going to do. You don't have to figure a way out of it or deal with the aftermath. You primarily prevent them from doing the thing. Now, that is not to say that small game Magic is easy, though it's interesting to note that in the Magic the Gathering community, people do often criticize the more small game strategies as being easier, whereas in Library of Ruina and Limbus Company, people are criticizing the big game strategy or game design for being easier. It's interesting to note that in Magic, people are critical of the small games. It's common to hear people say that, Red Deck Wins as an aggro deck is easy to play. And that is just not true. That's not true. You might make less decisions That's kind of true. But when exactly you destroy their creature or send the lightning bolt at their face or, deploy more creatures or whatever is very difficult. These are huge, instantly game deciding decisions in these strategies. It's more like a Wild West shootout. It's like saying a Wild West shootout and a gunfight. You're hiding behind cover and shooting out at people. It's like saying that those things are different difficulties. No, they're just different. They're just completely different. They're not one. It's not that one is harder than the other. They're just not related activities, really. I think that this is a big flaw in some way, just as an aside, in Magic the Gathering. I feel like the way you play, red deck wins or a tempo deck is not very related to the type of fun you get from a ramp deck or like a control deck. And I think a flaw in Magic is that what your opponent picks to play affects what type of game you're going to end up playing, and you may have liked one or the other. You might not like both. We'll certainly come back to that later, but you can see how it's going to parallel to Library of Ruina and Limbus Company. I don't know, I think it's more like people got Library of Ruina first, that's what they like, and then Limbus Company just isn't that related of a gameplay experience on the whole, while looking very similar to Library of Ruina, and thus people think, well, compared to the type of complexity that Library of Ruina had, Limbus Company doesn't have that type of complexity. But that doesn't mean it doesn't have complexity. And then I think some of those players might see that, oh, well, there's a button to just do auto clashes. That sounds like something you'd have in a game that's just easy all the time. But there are a good amount of fights in Limbus Company where you cannot just hit win rate and auto clash things. That is there so that when your turn-based combat is winding down, you can say, get out of here. Or when a fight is too easy for you, the game doesn't demand your attention for something you'll undeniably win. It's a convenience. That doesn't mean the game is inherently shallow. I want to go in another direction with this idea of, people who played Library of Ruina, well, Limbus Company simply isn't displaying the same type of tactical intrigue that Library of Ruina was, but it's not that it's necessarily easier. And I want to get into that a little bit more with the idea of types of difficulty presenting themselves in gameplay structure. This is where we're coming back to that pin about, well, people have played the end of Library of Ruina, but only the beginning and middle of Limbus Company because that's all that's out. So maybe that's part of the comparison. Maybe I want to talk a little bit about how Limbus Company starts out deliberately significantly easier than at least what I experienced in Library of Ruina, and how maybe that is creating part of the situation. So Library of Ruina, in my mind, drops you pretty much right in. And I don't think that's a bad thing. The game is going to be about tough trades and you dying and getting hit, and the game shows you that right from the onset. This is a pretty common approach with games like this. Darkest Dungeon is another example that comes to mind. When you load into the game literally puts a pop-up on the screen before you've even played the game that says, hey, you're going to die, get ready to adapt to a bad situation. And in so many words, Library of Ruina is doing the same thing. The beginning is going to be challenging enough that okay, there's a lot of moving parts, and let's get in there and see how you do. I mean, I didn't think it was extremely difficult, don't get me wrong, just to say that the game kind of asks that of you from the get-go. And Limbus Company, in my experience, did not do this. The beginning of the game and the first few chapters of the game are just not trying to be challenging, is how I would claim. They're not just not difficult. I'm not saying they weren't difficult for me. I'm saying I think the game design is not trying to challenge you in those moments on purpose, because it is a weird type of game and it's meant to be a mass market product. And I think that makes some sense. In Limbus Company, after all, if you don't have a good idea for how to approach a fight and make a certain team, build a certain team out, you literally can't win some fights. They're just impossible to defeat. Whereas you could imagine that in a game with variance, like Library of Ruina offers, where you're not going to clash and completely absorb all the enemies, you're probably going to take some damage. There's an element of randomness to how much damage you take. That, I don't know this because I haven't played the later parts of Library of Ruina, but I would imagine that that means you can probably keep trying and you will eventually get a better shake, and you might be able to succeed that way. Whereas I've seen many people in Limbus Company who insist that it's impossible for them to pass a certain fight, even though we know for sure that it isn't, because we've seen people do it often with base IDs. You know, pretty much all the story and challenging content in the game has been cleared with either literally just the base things the game gives you, or something very similar to just the base things the game gives you. And so we know for sure the player obviously can't, it's not impossible for them to progress. Why do you see posts and questions like that so often? Why do you see people saying, well, I just can't pass this fight? It's like, I mean, if you leveled up your units and you're doing the clashing, I mean, shouldn't it be straightforward, right? But it's an idea type of base difficulty. Now, again, having not played Library of Runa, I will just make a prediction that it kind of seems like that kind of difficulty too, on the surface. A type of difficulty where you have to come up with a good idea for what your character's builds are, so they're powerful enough to take on the difficult and not fully parryable bosses that will do some damage to you. I'm not saying that that means Library of Runa is just random. I know nothing about it. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just pointing out that when you break down the situation with the two games, if anything, you would kind of think that Limbus Company would be the game that people would say, oh, well, this is much harder. You know, sometimes it puts you in a situation where you just can't progress unless you have a better idea for a team. And there's not really the variance in your favor anyway to make it so you can power through sometimes. However, people on the ground are saying the opposite sometimes. They're saying they think Limbus Company is easier. Well, maybe it's easier in the beginning because the game knows that if it turns up the difficulty far enough, it's going to become essentially impossible. You can't just use an attack and maybe get out good damage. If you pick something that can't win the clash, it just can't win the clash. There's no dice roll that provides that variance. If your clashing value isn't high enough, this game provides the ability to get a reliable clashing value. So if you get that reliability, you're going to get this value in a clash, and you go for your clash and you don't have a high enough number, you just mathematically can't win the clash. I mean, you might get lucky and the enemy won't hit you back, but most of the time in Limbus Company, it feels like you know you're going to get hit. Like, you know you can't win this clash. Or you know you can win this clash, and there's essentially no chance that you're going to get hit. That thing you mentioned about Library of Runa, where most of the time you can't guarantee that you block everything unless you somehow find a way to get your minimum die roll higher than the enemy's max roll. That situation happens a lot in Limbus Company. You can ensure that you're going to win a clash, and it happens fairly often that you're assured to lose a clash, completely lose a clash. That doesn't sound easier when you break down like the structure of the design. So there are two explanations available here in my mind. Well, two parts to the explanation. One, yes, we are maybe in the early game easier part of Limbus Company, though I'm not sure I feel like we are anymore. I just feel like it starts out that way. Maybe Limbus Company displays a wider range of difficulties, or intended difficulties anyway, because it wisely understands that if the player can't think of a way to use the pieces to move forward, there's not much variance that is going to change the outcome. They will be essentially guaranteed to lose. Even if in Library of Runa, the variance isn't what I'm making it out to be, and you're still pretty likely to win if you have a good squad on hand. I mean, I'm just saying there at least is variance that means sometimes you might like do a bit better than you expected. Whereas I feel like that mostly doesn't happen in Limbus Company. You notice when it does, because it's often quite clear who's going to win a clash. That's just my feeling anyway. Okay, then explanation part two. Library of Runa came first. Limbus Company has a kind of cloud of ideas around it that make it seem like it would be easier. And this is where I'm going to add in my criticism of how players talk about difficulty. They tend to read difficulty in a kind of holistic way. They extrapolate what is true of the thing from its details, not from their own experience. If you didn't like the beginning of Limbus Company, why play a whole bunch of it? I think a lot of people didn't. And they're just saying, well, I played some of it, and the part I played was easy, because of course it was, but the part they played was easy. And maybe the beginning of Runa wasn't easy, and so, well, that means Runa is harder, right? And then they say, oh, well, this game is also an ongoing game, you know, a live service game. Those tend to be gestures vaguely, more mainstream, and so that's going to be easier. And look, the game has a button that just lets you assign clashes automatically. You can just hit win rate, and you win. And so this is a very straightforward game. And to top it all off, It's even got a gachapon mechanic inside it. So surely that means this is just like those other games where that's going to be really, really easy. It all makes sense. Every piece of evidence I've collected, the player thinks, points to it being easy. And for the beginning of my time playing, it was easy. So it must just be easy. Why? It would be crazy if someone said it was hard. Look at all this evidence that it's going to be easy. And I think this is a perfectly innocent thing people do sometimes. They're just trying to find a way to understand things in this overly complicated world we live in when they don't have enough time to just play through the whole thing. And why should they? If they weren't enjoying it, it's perfectly fine not to want to play the whole thing. You're not required to have a professional opinion about the subject. Where we get into trouble is that that person will then go on to behave as if they do have a professional opinion on the subject, even though maybe they didn't notice this. But they kind of turned what was an assumption. The game is like other gachapon games, and those games tend to not have the most robust mechanics, except for the popular ones. but anyway. And so it gets kind of simplified, and they think, oh, that means it is a simple game. No, that was just a pattern you noticed that suggested it might be, a more straightforward game. That wasn't a fact that proved it was that thing. And I think that people kind of make a little mistake when this happens. They get to that point of reasoning and they just kind of round it off. They say, well, that means it is easy. It's now a fact that it's easy. No. Playing the beginning of a game and having associations to other games, which when they're bad are bad, does not prove that all of a game is that way. Obviously, when you break it down that way, it's like you have practically no reason to think that, of course. But certainly you can see the comparison. You can see why people would think that about the two games. I think when you combine this with the fact that, sort of a bigger point, a lot of big games are, I think, easier than small games. Now we're getting somewhere. Let's get into the sort of the end of it. You've got a little addendum, CurryRice, which I think fits with this very well. But there's a sort of broader idea that I think it goes beyond just Limbus Company is associated with a bunch of things that make you think the game might be easier, and the beginning of it is easier, but I think that's just better game design to introduce the player to what will become a rather complicated system. Whereas Library of Ruina maybe doesn't do those things. And so I can see how it would seem easier from that perspective. But, and by the way, if this wasn't already clear enough, I should have said this at the beginning of the parlay. There's no, I mean, we're not even getting into in this parlay the idea that it's like better for the game to be harder or easier. It doesn't matter at all. We're just speculating on why people would perceive them that way. This is not even to begin discussing the highly questionable claim that the game being harder or easier is good or bad, or comparable or meaningful in any way. It's not there's your parlay on that one. But I mean, you could talk about that a lot. That's not an uninteresting topic. We're just not going to here. We're just going to assume it's just interesting to break down the ways the games do difficulty. I don't really care which one actually is harder. There isn't one that is just harder. They're hard in different ways. We've established that. Anyway, so I want to go further. I actually think it's true that games that use Limbus Company's format of a big game are unilaterally, almost universally, generally easier than games that go for the small game thing. And Limbus Company is a rare example of it not being particularly easy, just like Magic the Gathering. In the end, the difference in feel Ruina players had with Limbus Company is I think is close to the difference in players who enjoy small game decks like Red Aggro or a resource trading archetype like Jund, not enjoying big game decks like Blue-White Control or Mono Green Ramp decks. Further simplifying this, it's very similar to the difference between a 60-card constructed competitive player in Magic the Gathering not liking Commander Magic the Gathering gameplay. They're both playing Magic, pushing for a more strict trading of resources while the other is looking for synergies to build towards since everyone has way more resources to utilize. Is one more complex than the other? No, not really. They're games that play in a similar system that have differences in approaches to enjoy them. Ruina's system of keeping track of individual builds' resources might be something you enjoy more, and Limbus' system of making a team to enable conditionals and make combos without worrying about bricking might be something you enjoy more. All in all, seeing how much more popular Commander has gotten in Magic, I feel it's good that Project Moon is leaning into a game type that lines up closer to its growing player base. Yes, I think it's a lot more complicated than that, but I think that you are insightful to mention that, yeah, big games are popular, aren't they? Yes, let's get into that. And again, my overarching thesis here is going to be this idea that part of the reason I think that Limbus Company would seem easier on the surface, besides all the reasons we already discussed, is that games that go for that kind of big game feeling usually are easier, I'm going to argue. That's a slightly strong claim. It certainly is about a lot of things, but I'm going to explain why I think that, have experienced that. Yet, Commander and Limbus Company are, in my opinion, statistically unusual examples of big game design that isn't particularly easy. That's just not that common, in my opinion. And so people who've played lots of games generally will, when a game has the qualities that are like a big game type of game design, everyone gets to do their thing and, things scale or whatever. Those games tend to be easier. And so people assume, oh, it's like that. Like that's just easier. That type of thing is inherently easier. When in fact, no, it's totally not. You could make game design that makes that hard. And Magic and Limbus Company did make game design that makes that hard. It's just kind of uncommon in my experience for that to happen. Whereas the type of gameplay that Library of Ruina has, small games in general, tend, in my opinion, to be a little bit more technical or unappreciable from the outside. When people play a game of red deck wins aggro or blue tempo in Magic, I think it's harder to see the game happening because it's largely happening in the players' heads. And yet, I don't think anyone would argue that that's less complex. In fact, I feel like I more often hear that that is the more complex type of Magic play. By people who actually understand the game. Lay people tend to say, oh, well, there's less cards, so it's less complicated. Or red deck wins, you just go for face every time. It's like, well, maybe you're not giving enough focus to how hard they had to think about that one time they didn't go face, and that's why they won the match. It is very difficult, but just in a different way that isn't as visible. And so that's the beginning of this discussion. Big games, big game design, I never sold out to big game design. Big game design meaning like everything is out there on the board. You all get to do your thing, and things scale up to respond to everyone's propensity of resources. These games tend to be popular because everybody gets to do their thing. You don't have to understand some meta context about, I've got my one creature and I'm attacking, they have 2 mana untapped, what are they going to do? I have to imagine all the cards they could have, know the cards they could have, and imagine what they have, and imagine their situation. What are they going to do? Should I leave mana up to protect my guy, or can I be more aggressive? And that game just doesn't exist unless you have experience playing, in that case, Magic the Gathering. Whereas the game on the board, in theory, does exist. Now, I'll be quick to point out that certainly in Magic the Gathering Commander, it's not really a functional form of that game design unless people actually do know the same thing. Unless people break down, my opponent's got like 15 permanents in play. What is the thing that's keeping them alive? Like how can I break the mechanism that is keeping them alive? It is ultimately kind of the same thing, in my opinion. But certainly, if you don't know that sort of leveling and metagaming against your opponent kind of feeling, well, the big game looks like you got to play your stuff. You got to do your thing. To put it a different way, if we assume a player who is more self-centered, this is okay. It's not bad to be self-centered. It's your life, after all. It's your fun. But this is just common with people just getting into the game. They focus on what they're doing, and they get to do their thing in those games. And so you can understand how that would be popular. It's easier to have fun with a game that goes big like that, because the fun happens in a kind of different way from how it happens in people's heads in a big game or in a small game. It happens on the board. They see that they got to do stuff, and in that basic way, they can just kind of engage. Don't stick your nose up too much at this if you're someone who enjoys something more complex. Don't be tempted to think, people are just being, simple-minded and don't have the attention for the more interesting part of the game. Why do we have to cater to that? Okay, but people start somewhere. That's how people get into this kind of thing. They'll begin to think, wow, I can't really further myself anymore. My board is sort of chock full. I've got no more mana. What am I going to do? And they'll start analyzing what the opponent's doing. And I think this is how people get into enjoying the darn game. Don't be mean. It's fine to enjoy things in a more straightforward way. And it can be fun to do your own thing. In game design broadly, we see games where you're meant to just pop off on the enemy and do your combo. Devil May Cry comes to mind. And games where your combo doesn't mean shit to me, and I'm going to instantly kill you in one hit if you do your own combo. You have to dance with me and wait for your chance to do damage. Think Dark Souls. And it's not like one is better than the other. They're very different kinds of fun, obviously. And just like nobody would want to dodge incoming traffic for fun all the time, or never, but certainly not all the time, it would be silly to suggest that Dark Souls type of fun is just better, because obviously it will just like become fatiguing. It's not better to enjoy entertainment that is hard on you. That's obviously not better, but neither is there anything wrong with it. Like, that's fun, in its own way. Anywho, but the point I'm trying to make is that big games, I would argue, are the kind of basic type of design that you use to try to appeal to a player who hasn't engaged with the game very much. And so, yeah, it's true that there's sort of more of an on-ramp there. And I think that when you see all this stuff on the board, people tend to say, oh, that's why it's complicated, when in fact it breaks down to being similar, in my opinion anyway, to a small game mentality. And so, Limbus Company, with its lots of stuff going on, it's weird, right? You would think that that would make people, they look at the board in a big game of Magic, and they see a ton of stuff in play, and people who don't play the game will go, oh, that's complicated. Whereas if they see a small game, they see a tempo, aggro mirror, or whatever, oh, there's not very many things in play, that's simple, or something like that. Whereas players playing the game probably think, oh yeah, this is the game. If there's a lot of stuff in play, how is it more simple to play that other one? But only when you get more experience do you see that's kind of a false distinction. It's kind of weird, is my point, to look at Limbus Company and say, oh, well, this is simple from the outside. Except that when you start playing it, it looks like more of a spectacle. It looks like, oh, the game is it just wants things to look very nice. All the units clashing each other at the beginning of the round in Limbus Company. It looks like a nice spectacle, and that's there to entertain the player because the game is very straightforward. Again, you can see how that would fit into a narrative. I'm just pointing out that if you look at it a different way, there really isn't a reason to assume more stuff in play means it's simpler. Like, I wouldn't think so, really. And it's really only when you get more into it that players tend to think, oh, well, that big board full of complicated cards, everything dies to one board wipe. Whereas the small game, tempo, mirror match, or whatever, well, that's a game where you really have to crunch the numbers in your head and think about what your opponent's doing and stuff. Yeah, I mean, really, I think it's a false distinction. I'm just pointing out that certainly from some perspectives, I think players have a tendency to say, oh, that's just a lot of stuff. That doesn't mean it's complicated. Where on the other side of the fence, a lot of stuff looks complicated. Just as many people as people who say they think Limbus Company is oversimplified, I've heard people say, this just looks really complicated in a way that I feel like Library of Ruina maybe doesn't quite as much. It maybe looks more linear or more focused on one or two units. Limbus Company is a little bit rare in that there isn't as much of a focus on a single individual that is your character. It's more abstract, is I guess how I sometimes think of it, although Library of Ruina is pretty abstract too in my humble experience. So that was a lot of stuff. Again, I hope it's not overly confusing. The point I'm trying to make is just that you can see both sides. You might interpret the spectacle or many pieces in play, big game, Limbus Company, as being very simple or very complicated, depending on perspective. And I think it only really makes sense that people would be so convinced it was really straightforward in the context of Library of Ruina being right next to it. It might look like, oh, this isn't a game that's pursuing that type of, mental strategy, focusing on what the opponent's going to do, responding to things kind of thing. But in fact, Limbus Company is almost exactly that. Like that is the challenging stuff in Limbus Company anyway, is that thing. It just might be true that there are more things of different difficulty levels. And I might speculate that some of the people who've been very critical of the difficulty in Limbus Company maybe simply haven't played, all of it, the harder parts. If they have, and they still think that it is much easier, well, it's subjective. It might be that they're better at the thing that Limbus Company asks of you as a challenge. It might be that if we could poll all humans, it turns out that Library of Ruina actually is more mentally demanding, if you like. I'm not sure that really matters, but that's very possible, sure. Nobody can really objectively make that comparison, so that could be part of why. Sure. I would also speculate, though, like I was sort of poking at in the earlier segment, that players have a tendency to say if something requires a lot of tries or, will just kill you sometimes, that is difficult. But that is random. That is not difficult. That's just you die randomly sometimes. Now, again, I haven't played Library of Ruina, so I'm not saying that that is what happens in that game. I'm just saying, players think trying something over and over again is inherently more difficult than something you could beat on the first try. That could mean that the thing is more difficult and you need more tries to think about it. Or it could mean that your agency, when you try the thing that takes less tries to beat, is simply rewarded more promptly. You see what I mean? Limbus Company you could consider is more reliable than something like Library of Ruina. I don't know if that's true, but you could, if that was the case. Then winning a fight sooner doesn't mean the game is easier. It could be harder. It's just that your good idea is rewarded the first time. You could think of it that way. And indeed, I think many times in Limbus Company, if you think about resetting basically every fight, mirror dungeons really reward this. You can pretty much just redo any fight in a mirror dungeon and it's not a big deal. The game weirdly rewards that type of gameplay, which I've never totally understood. If you think about doing that all the time when you do a mirror dungeon in Limbus Company, you notice that it's not that often that there is a reasonable expectation that things will go better. You know what I mean? Usually it doesn't make sense to do. Sometimes your sanity kind of snowballs negatively at the beginning of the fight, but in my opinion, and having retried fights plenty of times in Limbus Company, it's only rarely that makes sense. Like that there is much of a chance that you're going to do better. And only on very, very, very rare occasions is there a fight in such a way that kind of breaks that. Personally, I thought that what's the title of that fight? But the fight against Jun, this is a mini boss, a lieutenant in the Blade Lineage related event. I think that's true. So this guy's probably a Kurokumo lieutenant. Anyway, this was a boss, but he was in Limbus's normal encounters where you can't pick exactly where each attack goes. There are some very specific tactics you can use to control that fight, but they aren't things you normally employ in gameplay. So my experience was that fight was fairly random, but I don't think that speaks to Limbus Company's design as a whole. I think that's a fluke. That's that one fight only. I can't think of any other time that felt that way, which is why I think that fight was such a bad piece of design. Even if there are ways to control it, it's just such an outlier in terms of the game's design as a whole. It's not what the game is trying to do regularly, in my opinion. So to summarize my incredibly long-winded difficulty thing, well, I said a lot of points in there, but just to add a sort of more specific one, I think that players just perceive anything that takes longer as being harder, but it obviously isn't. Like things that are short are obviously not necessarily easier to do. Needing to try something over and over again takes its own type of difficulty, sure. You need the mental endurance to maintain your sanity while inanely trying a fight over and over again. And this is not to say that the Limbus Company fights or the Library of Ruina fights are not hard and time-consuming. They may very well be for many people. I'm just saying that I think most players have a very bad, very unhelpful perspective on what difficulty actually is, and it's not harder just because you have to try more times for your good plan to work. That's not harder. I'm not saying Library of Ruina is like that. I'm just saying Limbus Company isn't like that. And I think that makes it appear that you will finish a fight more quickly. That might make it seem easier, when in fact you don't notice that it's simply that your strategy made you win. And so that's why you won on the first try, because you should win if your strategy would make you win. I would argue that's largely a good thing. And you don't see how, if you hadn't had that good idea, that good strategy, in fact, it would have been extremely difficult, practically impossible. You just did think of the good strategy. So again, it's hard for me to be reviewing and comparing the two games, but you can certainly see how it's easy to paint a quite involved path toward how people would think that the one game would just be simpler, even though they seem to be just completely different. I personally had a good time painting that path. I hope that my ramblings on the subject were still interesting in some way. I found it hard to organize. I realized as I started talking about that thing toward the latter half of the parlay, it's hard to organize because there's a lot of different player perspectives. Players will often interpret the big game board as being more complicated from the outside, and it's really only players on the inside that will think, well, that's just a lot of stuff though, that's not the focused experience that this provides. When in fact, when you break down the mechanics in Limbus Company or Magic, that very involved board is pretty complicated even to an established player, when the difficulty is turned up anyway. A really interesting parlay. Thanks very much for joining us. Thank you for the prompt, LastCurryRice. I personally enjoyed it quite a bit. I found your argument compelling. I like the idea that you can think of things in terms of big and small game resources in game design in general, and that can kind of inform how games compare in terms of difficulty. Personally, I think that bad discussions about difficulty are one of the great plagues of the game industry, and it is useful, it would behoove a developer that was so inclined to find a way to demonstrate the way that their game is complex. For example, in Limbus Company, it would be interesting to put the player in a situation where they see how you would fail if you tried a bunch of other strategies. So the player knows they're doing well if they're doing well, and also knows there is a way to win if they're doing poorly. I speculated in the past that it would work well if you created a system where players can just see other players' attempts, and maybe if they make a team, they can see, oh, someone succeeded with this. The game just gives them a little thumbs up, like you're not playing in vain. There is a way to succeed doing it this way. So the player doesn't disengage and start blaming the game. Oh, this fight is just not accessible if you don't have these units. No. Save the player from those inane arguments and instead let them enjoy engaging in the difficulty if they want, or know the game isn't for them if it's not for them. And you definitely could do something convoluted to get the player to understand that. Certainly, I've thought this in many games I've played before. In a given encounter, am I just being an idiot in this particular encounter, or is it an outlier in terms of design? What exactly is going on? And I have the time to just break that down for a living. But I think a lot of people don't, and understandably get turned off of some games. In any case, I hope an interesting summary or a way of describing. It was 45 minutes, so not really a summary. Looking forward to the next one.